We are introduced to Roy Pulver, a retired Delta Force soldier who has relived the same day over 100 times, as he's trapped in a time loop that resets the day every time he dies. Roy wakes up on May 9th at 7 a.m. every day by the screams of the woman beside him as a man with a machete tries to murder him. Roy almost effortlessly fends the man off, but then a helicopter appears outside and rips Roy's apartment to shreds with a minigun. Of course, as Roy laments how he'll never get his security deposit back, he knows where and when to move to avoid every attack, and jumps out a window into a truck filled with sand to escape. Roy then steals a convertible from who he has nicknamed Mr. Man's Man and drives away to escape two more assassins in a minivan. Roy doesn't know their names, so he nicknames them Esmeralda and Pam. During the car chase, Roy wonders if he got to the bus yet, mere seconds before he's rammed by a church bus, killing him. But this only causes the day to reset, and the process starts all over again. As Roy gives a recap, we see a highlight reel of his previous loops, where we are introduced to more assassins that Roy has nicknamed. This includes Kaboom, a dwarf who kills Roy with explosives, Smiley, who likes to kill Roy by harpooning him and dragging him with his truck, the German twins, and a guy who looks very similar to Roy, so he just calls him Roy number 2. The only real name Roy knows is Guan Yin, who always announces her name after she decapitates Roy with her sword. Roy thinks the only person who can explain his situation is his ex-wife, Gemma Wells, a scientist and the only woman Roy has ever loved. But when he tries to call her, the phone is answered by her boss, Colonel Clive Venter, who tells Roy that Gemma died in an accident. Roy believes that he's lying, that he killed Gemma himself, but he's never lived long enough to learn the truth. During the attempts where Roy manages to live long enough to avoid the assassins, he likes to get drunk at his friend Jake's diner, where he must hurry to get to the bar, or else the last seat will be taken by Dai Feng, a world champion swordmaster that Jake has a crush on. As Roy gets drunk, he listens to the man sitting next to him, a security specialist named Dave, talk about internal security and conspiracy theories. Roy anguishes over the fact Dave tells the exact same story every loop, no matter what he says to Dave. Roy explains that he chooses to get drunk because no matter what he tries, the assassins always find him at exactly 12:47 p.m., and that he's never once made it even a minute past this point. As Roy bleeds to death yet again, Roy remembers the increasingly distant yesterday, the last normal day he had before becoming trapped in the time loop. Roy is visiting his ex-wife Gemma at her workplace, Dynal Labs, after she tells him that they're hiring security. However, Gemma doesn't seem interested in either his resume or in reconnecting after being apart for a while. Instead, she focuses on taking Roy's measurements and taking a sample of his hair, which also draws blood as she cuts it. Colonel Ventor and his bodyguard Brett watch the two through security cameras as Roy asks Gemma about the large, weird machine she's working on, which she claims can unmake all time and space, and even destroy the planet if used improperly. Roy also brings up their son Joe after seeing his picture on Gemma's desk, who doesn't know that Roy is his father, because since Roy was always away working with Delta Force, Gemma never told Joe the truth to avoid unnecessary heartache. Begging to be heard, Roy tells Gemma that he can't accept having lost her when he chose his work over her in the past, but that he also deserves a chance to be in his son's life here and now. The two are interrupted by Brett, who reminds Gemma this is a restricted area, but she reminds him that she has got a special agreement with Ventor. When Roy tries to give him his resume, Brett says they are not hiring, implying Gemma wasn't being fully honest for whatever reason, but she sends him away before he can say more. Before Roy is escorted out, Gemma tells him she sent him a birthday present that is incredibly important for him to open and that he should remember Osiris. Meanwhile, Ventor doesn't trust the fact Roy has seen and learned things about the strange machine. So he orders Brett to deal with him by hiring random assets instead of trained soldiers, so nobody can track the assassins back to them. He then invites Gemma to come to his office, where he scolds her for breaking security protocols by inviting Roy to the lab. Later that night, Roy is in his usual bar hooking up with a woman named Alice, who works as a dental hygienist. She is just one more woman in a long line of one-night stands, and the bartender implies Roy should just take her home, since like the women before, she won't fill the void left by Gemma. When Alice leaves for the restroom, Gemma calls the bar to tell Roy that she's about to do something drastic and she needs his help to protect Joe, but an eavesdropping Venter cuts off the line before she can say more. Roy could tell Gemma sounded upset, but since he couldn't understand Gemma's warning, he chose to go back to his place with Alice instead of trying to reach her again. While Roy and Alice have fun together, Gemma places Roy's hair and blood inside a strange tube and heads off for the machine she's been working on. Seeing this on the cameras, Ventor decides she has gone rogue and sends Brett after her. Roy wakes up again in attempt 141, regretful how that was the last time he and Gemma spoke. But now that he's revisited the memory of their last conversation, Roy realizes he's never checked the birthday present she sent him and finally opens it. Inside is a book titled Iset and Osiris, with a message from Gemma on the back cover that says, "Time waits for no man." Ironically, Roy is so distracted by the book that he forgets about taking the right steps to avoid the assassins. He swiftly dies 2 more times before he manages to escape with the book after finding a button in Mr. Man's Man convertible that he never noticed before. Pressing it makes the car go much faster, but also causes Roy to miss the exit to Jake's diner. So instead, Roy ends up at the underground Atlanta Mall and has a chance to read the book, though he doesn't understand what the story of Iset and Osiris has to do with anything. He interrupts his reading when he spots his son Joe buying something from an older kid. Realizing that he's the only family Joe has left with Gemma gone, he follows Joe into a nearby arcade where an esports tournament is being held. Roy approaches Joe and confronts him about ditching school to play video games, then asks what Joe bought from the older kid, but Joe shows him that it's just a bundle of trading cards. Relieved it's not anything illegal, Roy invites Joe to lunch and they leave the arcade. As they leave the mall, Roy looks at a clock and sees that it's 12:50, 3 minutes longer than he's ever lived before. Analyzing what he's done differently, Roy concludes that he's somehow being tracked and that the diner and the mall being underground were what protected him. But seconds later, the assassins arrive and kill Roy once again. Roy puts himself between the bullets and Joe, then tells Joe that he's his father as he dies. Roy awakens in the next attempt and tries to interrogate the machete assassin, but since he won't talk, Roy just throws him in front of the helicopter's minigun. We jump to Roy arriving at the diner and going straight to the bathroom, where he proceeds to undress in the bathroom to search his body for a tracking device, but he finds nothing. Remembering Dave knows all about this stuff just before he leaves, Roy asks him where he would hide a tracker, and Dave suggests the teeth. This brings back a memory to Roy, one of Alice, the dental hygienist, putting him to sleep on a dentist's chair while Brett watches them. It seems Alice was part of the trap all along. After getting more alcohol and some pliers from Jake, Roy goes to the bathroom with Dave, who watches in horror as Roy starts pulling out his teeth until he and Dave find the tooth with the tracker. A moment later, Roy number 2 arrives and kills Roy once more. With the day starting anew, Roy quickly interrogates Alice, who reveals that she was paid by Brett, the head of Dinal's security. Roy repeats the usual routine until getting back to Jake's and removes the tracker tooth again. After dying 144 times in one day, Roy smiles knowing he finally has a plan. He takes the tracker tooth to an abandoned building to use as a trap and successfully catches Pam off guard as she arrives. But since she refuses to say who hired her, Roy kills her with her own gun. It should also be noted that Roy became upset when he learned Pam was killing him this whole time with a pistol that belonged to a certain leader of a certain Third Reich. Roy knows Gemma put him here for a reason, but since he can't go back far enough to save her, he thinks everything is meaningless. The only thing that's left is revenge, so Roy uses his trackerless freedom to kill all of the assassins who have been hunting him throughout the many time loops. Afterward, Roy uses a phone he stole from Kaboom to talk to Brett and promises to kill him and Colonel Venter as well. But when he arrives at Dinal Labs, he impulsively tries to ram his car through the building's fence, where he just crashes and gets shot by Brett. Roy rapidly goes through a series of attempts where he tries different methods of breaking into Dinal, which include filling his car with explosives and impersonating Roy number 2. Stealing his clothes and ID helps him get in, But it still takes Roy a few tries until he learns all the tricks to get past the guards. When he finally gets through security, however, he comes face to face with his next obstacle, Guan Yin, whose sword fighting skills are too good for Roy to stop with bullets alone. During some attempts, Roy doesn't die quickly from the sword wounds, and he meets face to face with Ventor, who, Roy mentally complains, gives the same long, dense speech every time he dies. During one of these speeches, Roy manages to live long enough to learn that the name of the project is the Osiris Spindle. As Ventor kills Roy, he realizes two things. Ventor doesn't know the Osiris Spindle is working with Roy trapped inside, and that Gemma put Roy into it on purpose so that he can, as Gemma's book hinted all along, become Osiris and stop Ventor in his plans to rewrite human history. Feeling empowered after he realizes Gemma put him in the spindle because she still believed in him, Roy sets out with a new plan. After going through the usual routine up to removing the tracker in the diner's bathroom, Roy approaches Dai Feng and asks her for sword lessons, and she accepts to teach him because she finds him intriguing. Roy then proceeds to spend nearly 50 loops training under Dai Feng until he is skilled enough to best her. Afterward, he thanks her for the lessons and heads off to Dinao once more. Meeting Guan Yin once more, she is obviously overconfident when Roy chooses to fight with a sword. Roy proceeds to tease her by cutting off her ponytail as they fight, and ultimately Roy kills Guan Yin with her own sword. Ventor and Brett arrive, but Brett dies when Roy stabs through his forehead with the sword. Ventor and Roy briefly fistfight, but when Ventor tries to grab a pistol, Roy pins his hand to the ground with the sword. As Ventor realizes that he's been put inside the spindle, Roy says that nobody should play God and rewrite history, that the past should be left as it is so we can learn from it. Ventor thinks those are big words coming from an absent father and implies Joe may be in danger, which enrages Roy. After killing Ventor, Roy races to the mall, but finds out he's too late. His son is dead, and he wonders how many times this has happened during the previous loops. Roy tries to fight through the officers on the scene to see Joe's body, but suddenly a bright light appears on the horizon. It's the end of the world, just like Gemma had warned. Roy comes to the conclusion that it's his fault Gemma died, because he never called her back when she needed his help. Blaming himself further for not only getting Joe involved, but also for ending the world, Roy gives up entirely and spends the next few loops in an apathetic state, allowing the assassins to kill him over and over. One morning, however, the violence finally snaps Roy out of it, and he decides that even if he can't stop the end of the world, he should still do something. So Roy returns to the mall and meets up with Joe to spend the day together, playing video games and having lunch, just bonding like this every loop until the end of the world comes and resets the day all over again. Just before loop 249 ends, Roy brings up the subject of Gemma's work, and Joe reveals he talked to her early in the morning after she didn't return home. Roy looks at Joe's phone and learns that Gemma was alive when he woke up. Roy is shocked. He always thought she was killed during the night. Now knowing there's a chance, Roy smiles as the world ends once more. Roy races through the next attempt until he sneaks into the lab and shoots Ventor and Brett while demanding answers. Brett confesses they had been trying to find out what she did to the Osiris Spindle, and Ventor realizes Roy was able to sneak in because the spindle is working, which means Gemma made him the missing mass and is why they can't stop the machine. Seeing security footage of Gemma being strangled, Roy finds out the exact time of Gemma's death, 14 minutes after he wakes up. So Roy shoots himself to restart the day, deciding to try to save Gemma. This time Roy quickly kills the first assassin, but changes the routine by jumping from the window and into the helicopter, kicking the gunman out and threatening the pilot with a gun, ordering him to take him to Dinao Labs as fast as possible. Once he arrives, Roy takes the helicopter's minigun and uses it to effortlessly kill all the assassins as they're waiting outside Ventor's office. Roy snags a gun and Guan Yin's sword from the pile of bodies and fights multiple guards as he climbs down the stairwell to Gemma's laboratory, where she's being strangled by Brett. Roy doesn't hesitate to kill both him and Ventor in seconds before reuniting with Gemma. She asks how many tries it took for him to save her, and Roy lies, saying it only took one. But Gemma soon learns the truth when he begins telling her all the things he has learned about Joe, after promising her he is safe and that no assassins are going after him. Gemma explains that there is no stopping the spindle, only restarting it. She made the missing mass inside the machine match Roy's DNA specifically, so if he enters the spindle's core, the time-space continuum should reset for the last time and time would go back to normal. But she is not 100% sure of that. All this is just a theory, since this is the first time she managed to make the machine work, and it was all done in a hurry to stop Venter. Gemma says if the machine doesn't kill Roy when entering it, he'd still have to restart the day one last time, where if he dies, then he won't come back. But Roy smiles and kisses Gemma before entering the core of the Osiris spindle.